Hello guys, welcome to another video of our React tutorial. In our last video we introduced Redux and we saw the difference between Redux and the context API. In this video we're going to talk about the Redux Toolkit. We all know that Redux is a very powerful tool, but the setup used to be very difficult. That's where the Redux Toolkit comes in. It's the official and recommended way to use Redux in today's React application. So in this video we're going to learn how to set up Redux Toolkit, create slices and use them in our application to do some basic operations like counter increment, counter decrement, and many other. So we'll proceed by installing Redux Toolkit in our application, and we are going to do that by going to our terminal and use our npm prompt. Right now I'm going to open up my terminal and I'm going to use npm install at Redux.js /toolkit space React Redux. So I'm going to hit enter, and this is going to install the Redux Toolkit and the React Redux in my application. After this is installed, we're going to proceed by creating a folder structure that will accommodate Redux in our application. Remember previously we had a folder called the state, which we use for our use context hook. Now we're going to create another folder to accommodate Redux. So I'm going to create a folder in the source folder. I'm going to call it Redux state. I'm going to do this. So inside my Redux state, I'm going to have few files inside my Redux state. So one of the first file I'm going to have inside my Redux state is my store. Right, one of the files I'm going to have is my store. So how do I create my store? I'm going to create a file in the Redux here, and I'm going to say store.js. Right, so basically let's change it to JSX just in case we'd want to use the JSX. So a few things I'm going to do in this store.js. First, I'm going to import the config store from Redux Toolkit, and we're going to proceed with that. First, I'm just going to say import configure store from Redux.js /toolkit. So this is the first thing we're going to install, going to import in our store, and we'll leave this up and we'll proceed to create another file. Another file we're going to create is going to be our slice file. It's going to be our slice file. So how do we do this? We're going to create a file called slice. So I'm going to create slice.jsx right. Inside my slice.jsx, I'm going to import one thing. I'm going to import the create slice from Redux.js. So I'm going to say import create slice from Redux.js. After that, I'll proceed to initialize my create slice. How do I initialize my create slice? I'm going to say const. I'm going to call it counter slice, because we're going to create a counter operation that helps us to count increment or decrement. Right. I'm going to say counter slice equal to the create slice we created, initialized, and it's going to take some few parameters. Right. The first parameter is going to take is the name parameter. I'm just going to call this counter, and the second parameter is going to take the initial state, and the initial state, of course, I'm just going to create an initial state of value to be 0. So the value of our counter by default is 0. The next property it's going to take is the reducer property, and the reducer, we're going to create our reducers. And we said we're going to create an increment reducer, we're going to create a decrement reducer, and we're going to create increment by amount. So we're going to increase our counter by number or by payload or by amount. So I'm going to call it increment by amount. Right. Let's go back to our increment. What do we have here? We're going to say state, right? And of course, we're just going to say state.value should be plus equal to 1. Right? If we do this, we'll have comma here. So I'm just going to copy this and duplicate to the decrement, and this is going to be state.value minus 1. So what do we do for the increment by amount? Increment by amount is actually expecting a payload. So we need to pass in the amount we want to increase by. So we're going to say it's expecting a state and it's expecting an action. Right? If we do this, say expecting a state and an action, we can proceed to say state.value, just like we did for others, state.value, right, should be plus equal to action.payload. So whatever payload we are passing, whatever payload, which in this case should be the amount, should be action. So it is going to be the initial state plus the amount we are passing in as the payload for the increment by amount. So that is it for the counter slice, and we're going to proceed by exporting what we have. So we're going to export const. What are we exporting? We're exporting the few actions. We're exporting the increment action, we're exporting the decrement action, and we're exporting the increment by amount action, right? If we export these three, and it's going to be equal to counter slice, it's going to be equal to counter slice, which we already have up here. So it's going to be equal to counter slice dot action. We're going to export all the actions of the counter slice, and we're going to export something else. We're going to export by default the counter slice dot reducer. So we're going to say export default counter slice dot reducer. So we've exported both the actions and the reducer in a slice.js. So after that, we'll now head over back to our store. So we can now proceed with our store. We're going to import our counter reducer from our counter, right? We exported our counter reducer. Right, we exported our counter reducer, and we're going to import it here. We're going to say import counter reducer from. We're going to import it from where? From our slice, right? So if you go back to this, it's taking us to the counter slice we exported by default. So after that, what's the next thing we're going to do? We're going to create a store handler. We're going to create a store handler. We're going to say const store should be equal to the configure store we imported from Redux Toolkit. So configure store. Configure store is going to take few parameters. Right, what are the parameters? First parameter is going to take is the reducer parameter, which is actually we're going to say this is going to be hold on. Yes. So this is going to be So this is going to be counter. Is going to be the counter reducer we created in our slice.js, right? So you look at this. We created a store function that takes that initialized our configure store, that takes a parameter called the reducer, and the reducer we're taking is the counter reducer we created. So after this, we're going to export this store. We're going to say export, right? We're going to export this store, so everyone will have access to this store. Just like I said, we use the configure store to create the Redux store. It includes good default like Redux, DevTool, and enables many other things, even tongues. And of course, it's really nice and out of the box. So the next thing we're going to do is to wrap our app in the provider. So we'll go back to our app.jsx, and we're going to wrap everything here in our provider. First of all, we're going to cut out all of this. So if you look at this is what we have. We have our path and our routes and every other thing. We're going to wrap everything here in our Redux provider. So I'm going to say provider, and I'm going to import provider from React Redux, right? Make sure you do that. And I'm going to paste every other thing I have. So every other thing is being wrapped with my React or Redux provider. So the next thing we're going to do is to pass in our store. We've already created a store. and the store we created, we're going to import it from our store.jsx. But before we do that, the Redux provider accepts a parameter called store, and the store is going to be the store we already created. So we're going to say store, right? We're going to say store, and we're importing the store from our Redux store, Redux state and store, which is what we created. So if we save this, and we'll proceed to the next thing we have in our plate. So before we proceed, let me take time to explain this again. What we did here was to use our Redux provider to wrap every of our routes, and what we did here to pass in the store to make sure every child of this Redux of this router has access to the store created in our Redux store. So we're going to see how to use the Redux state in our component. First of all, we're going to go to our profile page from our previous classes, and we're going to see how to create increment, decrement, and increment by amount in this. But before we proceed, let's head over to run our application to make sure we are on the safe side. So in my terminal here, I'm going to do npm run dev, and I'm going to hit enter. It should start my app in port 5173. So if I go to this port, it opens up in the browser, right? This is from our previous class. So if I try to access my profile page and I go to login, so this is the profile, and this is what we want. So the next thing we're going to do is to see how we can create actions that will trigger the increment, the decrement, and increment by amount. How do we do that? We'll go back to our profile. We're going to create 3 different buttons, right? We're going to create a button. We're going to say button, and this button is going to be increment. We're going to create another button, decrement and increment by amount. So this is going to be decrement, and this is going to be increment by amount. If we save this and go back, we have 3 different buttons, right? We're going to add little style into this button. Right, so we have the button style, and we're just going to add the style to our buttons. We're going to say style should be equal to style, and we're going to do this for all the buttons. We're going to say style should be equal to style. If we save this and go back to our page, we have the 3 buttons well styled, right? So the next thing we're going to do is to see how we can add events to this button. For the first button, we're going to add the onClick event. If we add the onClick event, we're going to call a function that we're going to create, right? We're going to call a function that we're going to create right away. And this function we're calling is supposed to trigger the increment action. But then before we do that, we're going to import few things from React Redux. We're going to import what is called the use selector, use dispatch, and we're going to import all our action from the Redux we created, from the Redux Toolkit we created. So first we're going to say import. We're going to import use dispatch. We're going to import use dispatch. We're going to import, we have use dispatch, and we're going to import use selector as well. Use selector from React Redux, right? After that, the next thing we're going to do is to import both the increment, decrement, and increment by amount we created earlier. So we're going to say import decrement, increment, and increment by amount. So we are importing all of them from the Redux state/style. So make sure, see what we did there. We imported these 2 files, and we'll go back to our action. So we say when we click on increment button, what do we do? We're going to call the dispatch, and what are we dispatching? We're dispatching an action. And what is the action we're dispatching? We're dispatching the increment action. So we're going to say, when we do that, we're going to dispatch an action. Hold on. Before we do that, we're going to first of all initialize our dispatch in our application, right? We're going to initialize our use dispatch rather, and we're also going to initialize our use selector, which is going to be our default state. Right, so how do we do that? We say const dispatch is equal to use dispatch, right? The use dispatch we created, and we're going to create our state, our default state, which is going to be initialization of our use selector. I'm going to say const count, right? It's going to be equal to use selector, and the use selector is going to take up few things. which is we're going to have the state, and we're going to say state dot what, state dot counter dot value, right? Counter dot value, right? State dot counter dot value. So if we do this, we can now have access to the dispatch, which we're looking for here. So what are we dispatching? At this point, we'll now dispatch the increment action. Or I say increment, we're just saying +1. So we're only incrementing by 1. We are decrementing by -1, right? Let me wrap this in a parenthesis. So this is what we have: increment by 1 and decrement by 1. That is for the increment action. So we're going to copy this on click event, and we're going to add it to the next button, which is the decrement button. And the decrement button, we're only going to call the decrement action, right? So when we get over to the increment by amount, what do? We're just going to pass in the increment by amount, and we're going to pass in the payload. Remember, from here, we're saying for the increment by amount, we're expecting, the action is expecting a payload. So the payload we're going to pass in is going to be the amount we want to increase by. So here I'm increasing by 20. All right. Here I'm increasing by 1. Here I'm increasing by 20, or whatever payload I pass in here. So to make sure our state is visible, right up here, we're going to create a component. I'm going to create a h3 component, which is going to be my count, and of course it's just going to be the value of the count we created. The value of the count we created. So if I save this and go back to my profile page, this is what to have. It's not really beautiful. So let's move this down to here. So this is what we have. Our count is 0 by default. So just to make sure we're on the safe side, let's go back to our code and see if everything is working. We go back to say increment by 1. If you click on this, our counter increases by 1. If you click on decrement, it decreases by 1. And if you click on increment by amount, it increases by 20. Remember, our increment by amount, we said 20. Now, one more thing we're going to add, one more action. What if we want to reset this back to 0? Because if we want to take this back to 0, all we'll be doing is to be decreasing by 1, which is, of course, very boring. So we're going to have another button we're going to call reset. If you follow this series, we'll talk about this. We're talking about the use reducer hook and how we saw how to reset our state. So if I call this reset, and I'm going to call this reset action, right? This action is going to be reset. Just pay attention how I'm doing this. If I do this, then I'm going to expect this action from the same place I expected the increment and decrement action, which means we'll go back to our slides.jsx and we're going to create a new action, which we're going to call the reset action. And what's the reset action doing for me? The reset action is setting our state to 0. Right? The reset action is setting our state to 0. So the state is going to be equal to 0. Right? If we do this, the state is going to be equal to 0. So if we go back to our profile page and just change this to reset, and we're going to just say reset to 0, which is of course our default. So if we go back to this and we say increment by 24, it's supposed to be 20, we had 4 already, and we click on reset, nothing happened. So let's go back to our code. So if we go back to our code, if you go to your slides.jsx, you realize that we did not export our reset just the same way we exported increment, decrement, and increment by amount. So if we do that, we export our reset and we save. And if we go back to our code, if we increase by 20, we can reduce to 0. So guys, this is how to create your increment, decrement, increment by amount, which is passing the payload, and resetting our state back to its default value. Let's go back to our profile page and I will explain. I said the use selector reads from the store, the use dispatch sends actions to the store, and just like that, our state is being connected and is being controlled. So a recap of what we did: we installed few dependencies, we installed the Redux.js Toolkit, and we installed the React Redux. We created a slice with states and actions. We configured our store, and using the configure store, we used the use selector to read from our state, and use the use dispatch to interact with our states to create actions to our states. Just like I said earlier, Redux Toolkit makes global states easy, predictable, and powerful. No more boilerplates, just clean and efficient, right? So that is it, guys, for this video. If this was interesting and impactful, Please don't forget to share, don't forget to like, don't forget to comment, and of course please subscribe so we'll grow our community. See you guys in the next video. Bye for now.